Hello, 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 hello. Hi everyone, and welcome to this live stream. Hello, 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 hello. Alright, so hi everyone. I hope you are doing well. And yeah, we are now live. It's midnight in my country, and I hope everyone is doing fine. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at Graphene, and we're going to be exploring it while building a simple project. So we're going to put that project together with SQLAlchemy, with Flask, and we're actually going to use Flask, SQLAlchemy, and Graphene to put together a simple GraphQL API. And I hope you guys learn from this video. Hope we are live. Okay, so let me set these things up real quick. So I'm going to be using Flask. I'm also going to be using SQLAlchemy, and I'm also going to be using Graphene Python. So I hope you guys are doing well, and let's start with a live stream. So right now I'm going to be walking through Graphene so that we get to understand it a little bit more. So Graphene is this tool that allows you to build GraphQL APIs with Python, and it helps you do that with a code first approach. Now there are other tools that can allow you to do that using a schema first approach, tools like Ariane or Apollo Server in JavaScript. So in this video I'm going to be looking at Graphene, and hopefully we shall be able to put together a simple GraphQL API by the end of this video. So let's get started. So right here we see that Graphene makes it easy for us to build a simple GraphQL API. Hey, what's up? Our Trevor. Nice to meet you in this live stream. So they say that Graphene is a library for building GraphQL APIs with Python, and its main goal is to provide a simple and extendable API for making developers' lives easier. So just like we see here, we have a simple query class that defines our data. So for us to be able to build a GraphQL API, the first thing we shall need is a data defined, or a database containing the data, and then using that data we define a schema. Then that schema will allow us to be able to query for the different fields that a GraphQL API may have. So right now we see that it's extendable, and it actually has other extensions for the different web frameworks. Now we can see here that we have Graphene Django and Graphene SQLAlchemy. Now since I am going to be using SQLAlchemy in this video, I'll actually be using Graphene SQLAlchemy. So let me get started by putting together our app. So I'm going to go to my VS Code right here, and within VS Code I already have an empty folder set up. So I'm going to open up my terminal, and within this terminal I'm going to start by creating a virtual environment. So I'll do that with Python and then -m, then I'll call virtual env as a command, and then I'll specify that our virtual environment folder is going to be called env. Now after creating this virtual environment, of course I'll have to follow the usual steps of activating it, and then we get to install our dependencies that we're going to need for this live stream. So right now I'm going to go here. So I'm going to actually go to the Graphene SQLAlchemy, but before I actually go there, let's first look at Graphene as a tool. So I'm going to go back to the home page. I think I'll go back to the home page right here, and I think I'm going to go and let's just actually check the get started section so that you get an idea of how it works. So I'm going to go right here within the get started section. So hoping that my virtual environment has been created. It's still creating, and yeah, it's done with creating. So what I'm going to do, is to activate it with source env. So this will be scripts and then activate. And now I'm going to begin by installing Graphene, so I'll do that with pip install Graphene. We're actually going to need Graphene. We shall also need Graphene SQLAlchemy. So we shall also need Flask, and we shall need SQLAlchemy. So I'm also going to install our SQLAlchemy. So this will go ahead and install our dependencies. It seems like we have made a mistake here. It's actually Graphene SQLAlchemy. So SQLAlchemy. This is actually SQLAlchemy. So let me go ahead and install the dependencies once again. And this will go ahead and install our dependencies. I don't know how many people are viewing right now, so let me try to check. And it's currently 6 views. Well, this is good. I thought no one was to turn up because it's a bit late said. Alright, so right now I'm just installing our requirements. So I hope you guys can see what I'm doing. So meanwhile, let me just be going back right here and viewing our getting started section. So what is GraphQL? According to the description below, GraphQL is a query language for your API, and they're saying that it provides for us a way to be able to describe the data provided by our server in a statically typed schema. Hello Solomon, how are you? Actually, check out Solomon's channel, Jeff for JavaScript. He talks about JavaScript. So GraphQL is a query language for an API, but it also provides for us a way to be able to perform queries on our API. So they have told us here that it describes our data using a statically typed schema. So a schema allows us to define how we have our data defined on our backend or our database. Now let's picture us having a database, and then this database has data that's defined in a certain way. So using Graphene, we'll be able to define a schema, and this schema will allow us to define how our data is in our database. So we also see here that it allows us to request data using queries. So here we request data in a query which exactly describes our data requirements. So we have heard of GraphQL. It actually helps you to get data, so you can get data depending on the field, and that is actually having you only query for the field you want. Good to have you here, man. All Python Newton students to tune into your channel. Yeah, I hope they do so. Although it's quite late right here, it's midnight. I don't expect any of them to turn up. So it also helps us to receive data in a response containing the data requested. So the beauty with GraphQL compared to REST is we don't have underfetching and we don't have overfetching, because when you query for a certain field, of course you're getting only data for that specific field. I hope my requirements have actually been installed, so I'll go ahead and pip freeze this to our requirements.txt. So I'll just come and say pip freeze, and then I'll specify that we're going to have a requirements.txt right here. So our requirements are going to be added to our requirements.txt. So I'm going to begin by creating a new file. I'll simply call this our main.py file right here. So let's go back to our documentation here. So we're seeing that Graphene just provides a tool to implement a GraphQL API in Python using a code-first approach. Just like I said, we use Graphene to build an API using a code-first approach, but then there are tools like Apollo Server in JavaScript as well as Ariane in Python that allow us to build GraphQL APIs. So we're going to be looking at a very simple example. Now here they're giving us an example of a simple query, and this query is only returning a field of hello, and this has an argument of friend. So we're only seeing that the only data that is being returned by this field is actually the data of hello, and then we have the argument, which is our friend, being returned for us as a friend. So just like I've done here, I've gone ahead and installed Graphene. Now we're going to create a simple schema. So let's create our schema here. So I'm just going to come within our main.py, and then I'm first going to go ahead and install our import our Graphene. So I'll begin by importing Graphene. And when I import Graphene, the first thing we shall need is going to be our schema. So in our example here, we have a query, and every time we are creating a schema, we create it using the object type class. So I'm going to go ahead and create that class. So I'll come here and say we're going to create a class, and this class is going to be a simple query class. Now this simple query class is going to be of type object type that we're actually going to import from Graphene. So I'll just come, or what am I doing? So this is actually going to be Graphene dot object type. And once we have this, then we're going to go ahead and define the different fields that we want to have on our schema. So in this case, we don't have a database, but we are going to look into how we can basically put together a database with SQLAlchemy, and then we go ahead and define different fields based on the database we have. So right here, I'm going to define, we have two fields here. We have a hello field and a goodbye field. So to do that, I'm just going to come and define a field of hello. Now this is actually going to be a string. So Graphene also provides for us types similar to those we have on our database. So I'll just come here, and all I have to do is I'm actually going to change this import statement right here. And I think you guys can see me struggling to code this, but let's go ahead and do this. So I'll just say from Graphene, we are going to import our object type, and then we're going to go also ahead and import our string. So I'm going to change this, and this will actually be our object type. Now our hello in this case is going to be a string. So depending on the query we had on our example, we also have a name, which is an argument. So I'll provide the name, and this name is actually also going to be a string. Now once we have this name, we can provide for it a default value. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we shall have a default value. My computer is lagging, but let me try to see. Oh, sorry for this. Alright, so I'm going to provide a default value, and the default value in this case will be stranger. So I'll just come and say we're going to have a default value of stranger. Then I'll also define a field, and this field is going to be a string. So this string is actually going to be just a string. So right now, since you have these fields defined, now we're going to be able to look into how we can query for these fields. But for us to query a field, we have to specify how we query for it. So I'm going to go back here in our example. They're actually telling us that we have to then define a resolver. A resolver is a function on a query class, or on an object type class or a schema class, that helps us to define how we want to return a certain field. Now in this case, we are saying that we are basically resolving hello, and then we are returning the name, which is an argument to that function. Now also looking at the resolver of goodbye, which is actually going to resolve our goodbye field and return for us a message. So to do that, I'm just simply going to come here, and I'll define a function which I'm going to call resolve. In this case, I'm going to begin by saying this is going to be resolve hello. Now it's going to take in the GraphQL context of root, and then info. Then I'm going to go ahead and provide our argument, which is going to be our name. Now that we have this name, I'm simply going to go ahead and define how we're going to return our response. So in this case, I'll just come and say that we're going to return. So I'll specify that this is going to be a simple f string. And this f string is actually going to be having hello, and then we shall provide our name, and we're also going to go ahead and define the resolver for our field of goodbye. Now this is actually going to be resolve goodbye. It's actually going to be goodbye, and shall provide root and info. Then I'm just simply going to come and return. This is actually going to be goodbye. So after doing this, then we are going to go ahead and create a schema that's going to make use of this query. So to do that, I'll simply come right here, and all I have to create is a variable called schema. So just like we can see here, we'll create a schema that's of type schema, or it's going to be an object of type schema. Then I'll just simply come and say schema. So I can use auto import, and it will import it from Graphene. And then right in here I can specify that we're going to have a query. Now this query is actually going to be of the class that we've created here to define our schema. So I'm just going to come and say that we're going to have a query, and this will be actually equal to our query. Now I'm going to go ahead and save. Now we've been able to actually create a basic schema. I wonder how many people are actually watching right now. Oh, 7 people. That's good compared to the fact that I did not actually plan this live stream. Alright, so what I'm going to do in this case is to now go ahead and look through this description. So they are telling us that each field in the data model is provided by the server using a scalar type. So in this case we have a string, an int. We're also having enums, lists, and objects. But we also have some fields that have arguments. Now we're going to be able to look into how we can be able to query this API. So using this example, they are also showing us the schema definition language, and this is showing us what we actually created on our fields. So by creating this class, what we're actually having is a type of query, and let me actually make it clear by representing it. So I'm just going to create a simple comment here. So what we're actually doing is to define a type, and this type is going to be for a query. Now this query is going to have fields. Now we're going to have 2 fields in this case. We're going to have our hello field, and this field is going to actually have an argument. So I'll provide that argument, which is going to be our name, and this name is actually going to be a string. So just like we see here, it's going to be a string, and it has a default value of stranger. So we can have something like the string type, and this is going to have a value of stranger. So we're actually going to have this as a value of stranger, and I'll just come in here and say that we shall have our value, which is actually going to be stranger. And then we're also going to have a field, just like we see here, of goodbye, which is going to be a string, just like we defined here. Now I'm going to come here, and what I have to do is to say this is actually goodbye. I think I wrote it badly. Now I'm going to come here and say that we're also going to have goodbye. Okay, so goodbye is also going to be a string, so I'm just going to come and say that we shall have this as a string. Now the beauty with Graphene is it's helping us do all this, but using a Python class. Now if you're using Ariane or any other tool that allows you to use a schema first approach, you'd actually be using GraphQL types, just like you see here. Alright, so now let's go ahead and look at how we can query basing on our schema that we've defined. So to do that, what I have to do, I'm actually going to remove this type right here. So when you come to our querying section, all we have to do is to define a query or a query string, and that's actually going to help us to return our data. So what I'll do in this case is to create a query string. Now let's say I wanted to actually query for only the hello field. I'll just come and create a query, and I'll just actually call this a query string. Now this query string is going to be a string, and it's going to have, so this is basically how we query for a specific field using Graphene or GraphQL. So in this case, I'll type name, which is the field we actually it's our hello field. So this hello field is actually what we want, and we expect that we want to return only the data of the hello field. Now to do this, I'm going to come here, and all I have to do is to say that we're going to execute this query using our schema. So I'm just actually going to go and print this out, or what I have to do is to create a variable. I'll call this variable our result, and this result is going to be a result of basically using our schema to execute this query. So I'll just come and say schema dot execute, and then I'll specify that what we're executing is our query string. So I'm just going to come and say query string. Alright, now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead and save. And after saving, let's go ahead and run this. So I'm actually going to come and first print out our result. So let's try to see what this is actually going to return. So when I save, I'm going to pull up our terminal right here and then say Python main.py, and this is actually going to return for us an execution result. So right in here, since we want only data for the field of the hello, we only return the data specific to that field. And in this case, since we have our name as a default of stranger, we're now seeing that we are getting our name as stranger and we don't have any errors. So this is working fine. Now let's try to query with an argument. So the way we query for an argument, we're going to come right here and we're going to actually see the difference. Now I'm going to create a variable called query with arguments, and in this case we shall define this as, so we're going to specify the field which is going to be a hello field, and now we're going to provide the argument which is our name. Now in this case our argument is going to be our name, and in this case we shall specify that our name is actually going to be let's say Jonathan. So I'll basically go ahead and close this. I'm actually writing a wrong syntax, so I'll change this to small letters, well, I mean not small letters but single quotes. And once you have this, then I'll come and say that our second result, which I'm going to call result2, and now this is going to be our schema dot execute, and in this case I'm going to write our query with args. And once you have this, I'm simply going to come and print our result2. So this is actually going to be our result2. Now when I save this, I'm just simply going to come and pull up our terminal right here. So I'll run Python and then our main.py, and now we see that we're actually having an error in our GraphQL syntax. I think what we have is an error is, did you mean to use a double quote? Actually we have single quotes here, so I'm going to change this. So I'll change this to single quotes. It's actually going to be single quotes here, and then I'll use double quotes in here. So I'll change this and let's try running again. So I'm just going to come and run this with Python and then main.py, and now we see that we're actually having two results. Now the first result we are having is one that has our default name argument, which is stranger, and the second result we're actually having is one that has our name that we've specified, that is Jonathan. So what this is actually showing us is the way we can be able to query and be able to return our data based on whether we provided an argument or not. Hello XVBNM48, I hope you're doing fine. So welcome to the live stream. So now we've been able to look at how we can be able to query. So I'm going to go back here to the documentation. So we have next reference. So our next reference is actually talking about types, the different types that come within Graphene. So we shall go to next, and when we go to next here, we can be able to see the different types that we can have. We have schemas, scalars, lists, object types, enums, interfaces, unions, mutations, and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and create a simple data store or a database that we can have to persist our data. So what I'll do, I'm actually going to be modeling this live so that you can be able to see it, or I'll actually do it within VS Code. So what I'm going to do is to come right in our project folder. I'm going to create a simple file. It's actually going to be within our DB folder. Sorry for this. So I'm just simply going to come and create this new file, and this file is going to be DB, and I'm actually going to put an init.py within our DB. And now within our DB here, I'm actually going to define our data or our database using SQLAlchemy from here. So let's start by modeling our database, so getting an idea of the database that we're going to have. So what we're going to have is a simple, let's just create a blogging database or something of that sort. So we can have two tables, so I'm actually going to model them right here. So we can have a table for users, and this can have the following fields. So we can have an ID, which is basically our primary key. So this is not actually how you can, but I'm just doing this so that you can make sense of the data that you shall have. So I'm going to have an ID, we shall have a username, and this username is actually going to be a string, and then we're also going to have an email, just to keep it simple. On the other hand, you're going to have a table of posts. So let's say each student posts something in a simple database or a simple application. Now actually we are going to start by defining our ID, and this is going to be our primary key. And now I'm going to go ahead and also provide our title. So we're going to have a title which is going to be a string, as well as our content. So our content is actually going to be also a string, or let's say it's going to be text. So once we have this, now we're going to also define a relationship between these two tables. So we're going to have a one-to-many relationship between users as well as posts. So I'm going to come, and what I'll do is to define a foreign key on our posts table, but this will also have a relationship so that we can be able to do a backref on the users table. So I'm just going to come here, and all I have to do is to say that we shall have a user ID, and this will basically refer to the ID of a certain user. So shall just come and say users.id. So having done this, now let's go ahead and actually use SQLAlchemy to model out this simple database. So since we have SQLAlchemy already installed, I'm going to go ahead and do this by first creating our base class. So I'm just going to go at the top of our code right here, and I'm going to start by, so I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So I'm going to start by saying from SQLAlchemy.ext.declarative, we are going to go ahead and import our declarative base class, our declarative base function. So using this base function, our declarative base function, we actually call it, and it helps us to create a class from which we inherit and create a database model. So I'm going to begin by creating that class. I'll call it base, and this is actually going to be a call to the declarative base function. Now I also need an engine that will specify which database we're going to use, as well as where it's going to actually be. So I'll come and say it's actually going to be from SQLAlchemy actually it's going to be from SQLAlchemy. We're going to import our create engine function. And after creating our engine, I'm actually going to come and say that we're going to have our engine, and this engine is going to be a call to the create engine function. Now that we have this, now let's specify where we need this database to be. So I can come here, and all I have to do is to specify where this database is going to be. So I'll begin by defining that we want to put our database right here within our project folder. So I'm actually going to be using SQLite, but you can use PostgreSQL. It's not that hard. So I'm actually going to come here, and let me try to create our database. So I'm going to begin by locating our current folder, or our root project folder. So I'll use OS, and then I'll create a variable called our base dar. Now this base dar is going to be the directory name of where we are, or the path to the directory we are. So I'm just going to come and say that we're going to say that this is going to be os.path, and in this case we shall find out the dar name, and this dar name is going to be the dar name to the real path to this file. So in this case I'll say os.path.real path, and in this case I'll basically provide our file, which is the name of the current file that we're actually having. Alright, so once you have this, now I'm going to create a connection string using this variable. So I'm just going to come and say that we're going to have a connection string, and this connection string is actually going to be os.path.join, and then we're going to join our base dar to the name of the specific SQLite database you want to use. Now in this case I'll just simply call it let's just call it posts.db. Now that we have this, now we're going to go ahead and use our engine, or show our engine where we want our database to be. Now just start by creating or passing this within our connection string, or I'll pass our connection string in our create engine function as an argument. And another thing I'll specify is going to be equals to true, so that you'll be able to see the SQL that is generated when you'll be able to carry out something on our SQLite database. Alright, now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead, and what I'll do is to define our tables. So I'm going to go ahead and save. I'll import some other things from SQLAlchemy, so I'm going to do this way. So here we're going to have create engine. Now I'll also import string. I'm also going to import integer because we're going to use it to define our ID. I'm also going to go ahead and define a column. So we're also going to have foreign key. So I think this is all for now. So I'm going to close our import like that. So I'll begin by defining our table for our user. So I'm going to create a class, and this class is going to be for our user. It's going to inherit from base, and in this case, after defining that's going to inherit from base, we need a table name. So I'll begin by providing a table name, and this table name is going to be our table name. So I'll just say users. Now that we have this equal to users, I'll define an ID. So we're going to have an ID which is going to be a column. Now when you have this as a column, you have to define the type. So the type is going to be integer. PC is somehow lagging, and actually this will be our primary key for now. So I'll just say we're going to have a primary key, and our primary key is going to be true. Now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead and define the fields that we have on our user. We have the ID, the username, and the email. So we defined the ID already, so I'll come and provide the email. So the email is going to be a column, and then this will be a string. So I'll basically specify that the longest title, the longest username I mean, is actually going to be, let's say, 45 characters. And then we shall say that we don't want this to be null, so I'll say we're going to have nullable as true, or actually it's going to be false. Yeah, false. Now that we have this, now let's go ahead and define our email. So I'll say that we're going to have our email, which is going to be a column, and this column is going to be a string, and this string is going to be having a max length of, let's say, 8 characters, and it will not be nullable. We're going to add a nullable constraint there, and then you say this shall be false. Actually failed writing false here, so it's actually going to be false. Now I'm going to provide a function that's going to allow us to return a string representation, so that will be our danda repre function, and this will take in self, and it will simply return a string representation. Now in this case, I'll just come and say that we shall have user, and we shall be able to return the user by their username. So I'm just going to come and say self dot username. Alright, so right now, since we have this, so now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead and also define our table for our posts. So that's going to be a class which I'm going to call post to also inherit from our base. And once we have this, then we shall define our table name. So our table name in this case is actually going to be posts. And once we have this, now I'm going to go ahead and also provide our ID column. So I'll just copy it from here. Actually, copy it from here and then paste it right here. So we're going to have it being the same for all tables. And once you have this, now I'm going to go ahead, and what I'll do is to basically define that this table is actually going to have a title. So this title should be a column, and this column will be a string, and this will also have nullable being false. So we're going to have nullable, and nullable will be false. I don't know why I write flash, so be false. And alright, so we shall also have content, and content will be column, and this column is actually going to be text. So we shall have text in here, and we shall also have a nullable constraint. So here we shall just say nullable equals false. Actually, just come and say nullable equals false. So now that we have this, actually seems like we never imported text. Let me actually see. So I'm actually going to go ahead and import this type. So another thing that we need is a relationship that links these two tables. Now I'm going to go ahead and create it. So I'll begin by importing the relationship from SQLAlchemy.orm. I'm going to come and say from SQLAlchemy.orm, we are going to go ahead and import our relationship. And once you have this relationship, now I'm going to go ahead and define this relationship. So what you have is a one-to-many relationship between our user table as well as our post table. So now that we have that, we are going to begin by defining that relationship in our user table so that you have a way to be able to track our users' posts. So using the backref, I'm just going to come here and I'll define that. In this case, we're going to be, since it's a one-to-many relationship, each user will have posts, and here we shall have relationship, and in this case we shall have this relationship, and we define the model to which this relationship is. Or in this case, it's actually going to be our user. Actually, it will be our post model. And once you have this, and let's specify the backref. So the backref is going to help us to be able to get users or a user's posts. So we can use something like user.posts, and that will return a list of posts. Now in this case, we are going to do that by saying backref. So I'll provide a backref attribute here, and in this case we shall specify how we're going to actually return posts or the author of a certain post. Now in this case, we're going to say that we're going to return it as author. Alright, so now that we've done this, let's define a foreign key on our posts table, or what we call our user ID here. So I'm just going to come here, and it seems like I still have a mistake. Actually needed to call this text. Now I think the error right here is gone, so I'll come and define our foreign key. So we're going to have it as a user ID. In this case, our user ID is going to be column, and then this will be a foreign key, so it's going to be an integer, and this integer is going to be a foreign key, so we shall define it to be a foreign key to our users table. So in this case, what I'm going to do is to come at the top here, and we shall have to refer to the table to which we are actually having this relationship. So we call this table users, so I'll just come and say that's going to be users, oh sorry for this, and then we shall have our user ID. Alright, now that we have this, let's go ahead and define how we shall return a string representation of our post. So I'll just come and copy this same function we have here, and then I'll paste it here. So let me fix the indentation. Alright, so instead of returning the username here, I'm actually going to return the title. So now that we have this, let's look at how we can be able to return, or how we can be able to actually go ahead and create this database. So I'm going to be referring to how they create the API with SQLAlchemy and Graphene using the official documentation on the website. However, I'll also refer to other websites so that you'll be able to learn something. Alright, so to create this database, we shall need to use our engine as well as our base class. So to do that, I'll just come right here, and all I have to do is to say that we shall have this as base.metadata, and then we shall call that create all function. Now this create all function is actually going to have an engine, where it's going to be requiring us to bind it to one engine so that it locates where it's actually going to create the database. So in this case, we shall bind it to our engine. And once you have this, now I'll just go ahead and create our database. So I'm going to save this, and when I save, I'll pull up our terminal right here. I'll actually not call it. Let me create a simple script that's going to actually help us to create this. Alright, so I'm simply going to remove this line. I'll cut it, and after cutting it, I'll go right here. So let me create this script just outside our DB folder. So I'm just going to call this our create db.py, and within our create db.py, now I'm going to go ahead and basically import what we've created in our DB folder. So I'll do that by saying from DB we are going to import our user table. We are also going to import our post table, and we're also going to go ahead and import our base class. So we also don't want to forget our engine, so I'll import our engine, and right after doing that, then I'll just simply write a simple print statement here, and this is actually going to print creating database. So in this case, we're going to say creating database, and then I'm simply going to come, and what I'll do is to create our database. So I'll paste this and bind this to our engine. So I'm just going to come and bind our engine, and when I save this, now let's go ahead and run this and see if it's going to actually go to create our database. So I'll pull up the terminal right here, and all I have to say is Python, and in this case we shall call create db.py. It seems like now we have an error. So it seems like we have an error in our URL. So I'll simply go to our db file here, and within our db file, it seems like we used so our connection string should have the database part as well as the location part. We forgot to specify that the database we want to actually use is going to be SQLite, and then we shall have to just concatenate this to our file. So once I have this, then I'm going to pull up our terminal and then run our create db.py again, and now we see that our database has been created, and we have different fields. So Ravi, Kiran, nice to meet you too, man. I hope you're doing fine. So the SQL here is actually generated. We've been successful in creating what we refer to as our data, or our data store, or our database in this case. So we've created a simple SQLite file, and that SQLite file is within our posts.db, and I think it's what we are having right in here. So it's within our db folder. Alright, so now that we have that, now let's go ahead and basically look at how we can populate this database. So I'm going to be using DB browser for SQLite to help us to be able to see our database. So I'm going to search for it. And my PC is a little bit lagging here. I don't know what's up with Windows most of the time. So I'll search for my DB. Oh, my computer is lagging. Well, actually, since we have the file here, let's just go ahead and create our posts and users. So I'm just going to come and go ahead and close that or minimize that. So I'll just simply come, and what I have to do is now to go ahead and populate our database. Now what I'm going to do is to actually call a Python shell, and within here, within our Python interactive console, I am going to go ahead and import our I'm going to go ahead and actually create a session that we didn't create, and using that session we shall be able to add our objects, or to be able to create some data to populate our database. So I'm going to go ahead and close this for now, and then within our DB here, I'm going to begin by importing our session maker. So I don't know why this imported itself, and this I hope you guys are enjoying the live stream. So I'm going to go right here, and all I have to do is to import our session maker class, and then we shall also import our Sculpt session. So we're going to be able to create a Sculpt session. So to create our session, I'll simply come down this side, and all I have to do is to say that we shall have this session, and this is going to be a Sculpt session, and this Sculpt session is actually going to have our session. So we're going to create an instance of our session maker. Oh, sorry for this. So in this case, we shall just say that we're going to have our session maker, and we shall just have to bind this to our engine. Now I'm just going to come and say bind is going to be equal to engine. Alright, so now that we have this, I can go ahead and import all of this. So I'll just say from, in this case it's going to be from DB. We are going to import our user, we're going to import our post, we're also going to go ahead and import our session. So using this, we can go ahead and populate our database. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new user object. So I'll say new user, or I can actually call this user new user 1, and this is actually going to be a type of user. So our user has two fields, which are the username, and in this case our username is going to be, let's say, user 1. Now this same user is actually going to also have an email, so shall say that our email is going to be user1 at, let's say, email.com. And now that we have this, now what I'm going to do is to actually create this object. Now that we have this object, let's go ahead and also create a post. So I'll just say new post, And in this case, we shall say that our new post is going to be an object of type post. So we shall actually have our post, and this post is going to have a title. So the title in this case is going to be sample title. And once we have this, now I'm going to also define our content. So let's say we're going to have our content, and in this case our content is going to be this is sample content for our post. So I'm simply going to come and create this object. Now, since we have a relationship between these two tables, we need to attach a post to a specific user, right? And we define the relationship between these two tables, and that relationship is actually using a backref of author. So if we wanted to establish that relationship between the post we've created and the user, I'll just come and say that I'm going to clear my terminal, or actually leave it like this for now. So I'm actually just going to come and say new post, and then we shall have to specify that we are attaching this post to a certain author, and then we shall specify that that author is going to be our new user 1. Now that we've done this, let's go ahead and basically commit this to our database. So we're going to be using our session that we've created. So I'll say session, and in this case, since you have two objects, you can use add all. And now that you have this, you can specify a list of all the objects that you want to commit to our database. And this is going to be our new user 1, as well as our new post. And this is actually going to be a list of the objects. And I'll go ahead and commit this to our database with session.commit. And this will go ahead and create them in our database. Now, if you want to go ahead and query for this, so let's try it. So I'm going to use our session to query for them. So I'll just come and say session dot, and then I call the query. So this query takes in the class we want to query. Now in this case, let's say we're querying for the user, and then we shall say want to query for all the objects. Now this is actually going to return a query set, or a list of objects containing only the user that we've created. Okay, now that's working. So let's try to do the same thing with our posts. I can just come and say session dot query, and in this case we are actually going to be querying for our posts. So in this case, I'm going to say that we're going to have .all, and this is actually going to return our post that we've created. Now, using this method, we're going to be able to create new post objects. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new post object. I hope you guys are watching me. How many people are actually watching the stream? So wow, this is actually 4 users watching and 21 views. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. So right now we've created our database and we populated it with few records right now. Now let me go ahead and basically populate another post. So let's add some posts. So I'll say new post 2, and this is actually going to be having a title of second post. So this will be second post, and then we shall have, oh, I'm actually having an error, so let me just repeat this. And what I'm going to do is to actually create a new post. So I'll say new post 2, and this new post is actually going to be a post. So when you have this as a post, it will have a title, and this title is actually going to be second post. And once we have this, now I'm going to go ahead and basically create the content. So I just say our content in this case is actually going to be, this is the second post, or something like that, something that is simple. So I'll just say this is the second post. All right, now we also need to specify the author, so I'll do that within the object itself. So I'll say that our author is actually going to be our new user 1 that we created, and then I'll just use our session to commit. Well, let's actually create a new post so that we add them as 2 objects. So I'll just say new post 3, and this new post 3 is actually going to have to be a post, and this post will have a title. So the title here is actually going to be third post, and in this case we shall have our third post having, so here we shall have our third post having a content, and this post is actually going to have the content of this is the third post. Alright, so I'll come and provide the author. So our author is actually going to be our new user 1. So we shall go ahead and save this to our database. So I'm also going to say session dot add, and then also shall specify an iterable, which is a list in this case. It's going to have our new post 2 and new post 3. So we're going to add new post 2 as well as new post 3. So I'm going to add them and then finally commit them to our database. So I'll just do this with session.commit, and this will go ahead and add them to our database. Now that we have this, let's go ahead and query for our post. So I'll do that with session.query, and then I'll specify the model class, which is our post class, and then we shall call all. So we now currently have 3 posts. Alright, so just like I said at the start of the video, GraphQL allows us to basically return a response of the data that we want using a query that we've defined, or our data requirements. Now we're going to be looking at Graphene SQLAlchemy, that allows us to basically carry out this using our SQLAlchemy ORM. Now we created our database, which is a simple SQLite database, and it has the different fields as we've described. We'll also go ahead and populated it with some data. So what I'll do in this case is to go ahead right here, and what we shall do is to, now the next thing we're actually going to do is to define a schema based on the data we have on our tables. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm actually going to call this schemas, and this will be found in the schemas folder. So I'll just create an init.py right here, and within here I'm actually going to come and create a schema from here. So now I'm going to go back to the documentation. So let's actually go ahead and look at the documentation for Graphene SQLAlchemy. So that is actually here. So let's just navigate to the documentation. So we actually have this example in Flask, which is actually nice. So let's actually see here. So we actually have the setting up, the creating of the table. So for them, they have a department and an employee, but I think it's still the same concept. They have a one-to-many relationship here. So they go ahead and create a schema. Now we're going to follow their example while creating our schema for our users and posts. So we're going to start by importing Graphene. So we create our schema using Graphene, and that schema is actually going to allow us to describe our data as it is defined in our database. So I'm going to go right in here. I'll begin by importing our Graphene. It's actually going to be Graphene, so I'll import Graphene. I'll also go ahead and import relay from Graphene. So I'll say from Graphene we shall go ahead and import relay, and then also going to import the various fields from SQLAlchemy, Graphene SQLAlchemy. So I'm going to come and say from Graphene SQLAlchemy we shall import. So we need to import the following. We shall import the SQLAlchemy connection field as well as the SQLAlchemy object type. And once we've done this, now I'm actually going to go ahead and, so let me see here, we're actually having 3 viewers. I hope you're enjoying the live stream. Alright, so go back to the code right here. I'm actually going to go here. So what we have here is we are also going to be importing what we created for our database. So I'll do that by importing. So I'll say from DB we shall import our, so I'll basically go ahead and import this, but I'll import them as, I'm going to change their names because we shall have a bit of confusion with while defining our schema. So I'll just come here, and what I have to do is to say that we're going to import our user class, and shall import it as our user model, or let's just say it's actually going to be our user DB model. So we're going to call it our user DB model, so that is we can be able to actually track it as our database model. Now we shall also have our post, and this post is actually going to be as our post DB model. So I'm actually going to come and say it's going to be our post DB model. Now also going to go ahead and import our session. So let's actually see here. They never imported the session, but all they had is the employee model, that session. We actually have that session, so I'll just come here, and what I'll have to do is to import our session. Alright, I think this is all. Now we're actually going to go ahead and create our two schemas, or our two classes that are going to define the data as you have it in our database. So I'm going to come here and say we're going to have a class, and this class is going to be having, so what you're actually going to have here is the name of our user model, or our user schema. So I am going to actually call this the user schema, and this user schema is going to be inheriting from our, so since we are using SQLAlchemy models, we are going to use the SQLAlchemy object type class instead of the object type class that comes from Graphene. So I'm just going to come here and say that we're going to be using the SQLAlchemy object type. Now we shall create a class, and this class is going to be the meta class. Now this meta class is going to have the following attributes. We shall have a model, and this is actually going to be the user model, so we actually call this the user DB model. And now we're also going to have what they specify as the interfaces through which we're actually going to be querying for fields on this specific schema, or based on this existing schema. So in this case, we're going to define another attribute which is going to be interfaces, and this is going to have a tuple which is going to contain the interfaces. Now the interface here we're going to have is going to be relay dot node, and once we have that, we're going to do the same thing for our user, or our post model in this case. So I'll just come and say class, and this is going to be our post schema, and this is actually going to inherit from SQLAlchemy object type. And once you have this, I'm going to create a class. My computer is lagging, so I'm actually going to create a class, and this class is going to be called the meta class. So within our meta class, I'm going to define our model, and this model is actually going to be our post model, or our post DB model. Now I'm going to also provide our interfaces. This is actually going to be our interfaces, so an attribute called interfaces, and this will be equal to, so this is actually a tuple. I'll add the comma, and we shall also say that shall have relay.node. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. So when you go right here, the next thing when we do is to describe our main query class. So just like we see here, this main query class it's actually inheriting from an object type class from Graphene. So let's go ahead and create it. So I'm going to come right here, and all I have to do is to basically create a class, and this is actually going to be our main query class. Now this main query class is going to be inheriting from object type, so I'm just going to come and say it's going to inherit from Graphene. Graphene dot object type, and once we have this, now I'm simply going to go ahead and describe the field that we shall have here. So I'm going to begin by saying that we shall have our node. So this node is going to be the field that's going to be from our relay.node as we specified in our interfaces. I'm just going to come and say node. It's actually going to be relay dot node dot field, and we're going to look into the explanation for that in the documentation. So we also have all, so this field is actually for returning all our posts. So let's actually start with users. So I'll just say all users, and in this case we're going to actually have it as our SQLAlchemy connection field, and it will basically return a connection to our field or our employee schema. So in this case it's an employee schema, but for us we are going to be actually connecting to our user schema. So I'm actually going to come here and shall have our SQLAlchemy connection field. Now it's going to have a type. Now we're going to specify that it's actually going to be our user model or our user schema, and then we shall have to access the connection attribute. Alright, so we're also going to do the same thing for our posts. Now I'm going to come here and say all posts, and in this case it's actually going to be SQL Alchemy. Here we shall have connection field. Now this is actually going to be for our post schema, and in this case we shall access our connection. Alright, now that we have this, let's go ahead and look at how we can be able to query this schema, or to be able to write queries on our GraphQL schema. So I'm going to begin by defining our schema, of course, and it's going to take in our query as our query class right here. So I'm just going to come here, and all I have to do is to define our schema variable. Now this schema variable is actually going to take in, is going to be our, so I'm just going to come and say it's going to be graphene.schema, and then it's going to take in a query. So this query is going to be our query class, or our main object type class. And once you have this, now we've been able to create our schema, or our GraphQL schema. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at how to create a view. So the definition for this is we create a schema, and here they are saying that GraphQL represents our objects to the world as a graph, and the graph structure has different nodes, as we're going to see. So rather than, it actually represents our data as a graph structure rather than a hierarchical structure to which we are accustomed, or which we are used to. In order to create this representation, we need to know about the type of the object, or how it will appear in the graph. So you have our root type, which is actually the query class we created here, and this query class, it actually has fields such as all. So for us to have all employees and all users, as well as all posts. Now we can be able to actually access the various attributes using the node field, as we're going to actually see. Now let's go ahead and be able to create a view that's going to allow us to access our GraphQL API. Now Python, or Flask allows us to use class-based views, and I actually made a video about class-based views in Flask, and we're going to be able to add a URL rule for our GraphQL endpoint. So I'll begin by creating our Flask server. So I'll go to our folder here, and within our folder I'll go to our main.py. So I'm going to remove this code that we wrote, and I'm going to begin by importing our Flask class. So I'll say from Flask we are going to import our Flask class, and then create a Flask instance, or our app instance, and this is going to be underscore name. It's going to take in an import name. Now that we have this, let's go ahead and add a URL rule that's going to take in our GraphQL endpoint. So GraphQL, what makes GraphQL nice is we don't actually have a lot of endpoints. We only have one URL that you can go to and be able to see our graph, or make our GraphQL requests in this case. So I'll just come and do that with app. In this case, shall say app.include. Actually, it's going to be add. I keep on forgetting this, but it's going to be add URL rule. And once you have this, now we need a way to access that view that's going to allow us to basically use GraphQL. Now when you go right here, we forgot to install Flask GraphQL. So if I go to our terminal right here, I'm going to exit our Python shell, and then I'll come and say pip. Here we shall have pip list. So within our pip list, we don't actually have Flask GraphQL, so let's go ahead and install it. So I'll do that with pip install, and in this case I'll say Flask, and in this case we're going to have GraphQL. So Flask GraphQL is actually going to allow us to have the class-based view that we're going to attach to Flask, so that we'll be able to add a GraphQL endpoint onto our application. Now we're going to be using a tool called GraphQL that's going to allow us to make these GraphQL requests in a very nice and interactive way. So let's wait for our Flask GraphQL to install. Meanwhile, let me go back to the documentation right here. So what we have is we are going to create one endpoint, which is the /GraphQL endpoint, or the URL, and then we shall have to provide the view function as our class-based view, or the GraphQL view, and then we shall also have to specify that we're going to use GraphQL as our tool for using our GraphQL interface. So I'm just going to come right here. It's actually installing. Let me wait for it to install. Alright, so it's done with installing. Now since we have this, I'm going to go ahead and pip freeze it to our requirements.txt, and once we have that, now I'm going to go ahead and basically go ahead and add that URL rule. Now I'm going to do that by first importing it, so I'll just come and say from Flask. In this case, we're going to come and say from Flask GraphQL, we shall import our GraphQL view. So this is actually our GraphQL view, and this GraphQL view is the class that we shall add. Now while adding a URL rule, the first thing we shall have to specify is what is the URL that you're actually adding. Now this URL is actually going to be /GraphQL, and once we have this, now I'm actually going to specify a view function or our view func. So this view func is actually going to be GraphQL view. Now to call a class-based view as a function-based view, we'll have to call that .asView method onto that class-based view. And once you call that, now we shall also have to specify some things in here. So the first thing we shall have to specify is the name of that endpoint. So I'm going to call it GraphQL, and actually it's going to be /GraphQL, and then right in here we're actually going to have our view function. Actually we specified our view function already, so we're going to have our schema being the schema that we've created. So I'll come and import it. So I'll say from schemas, we are going to go ahead and import our schema that we created. And once we have that, now I'm going to come here and say that we're going to have our schema equal to the schema we've imported. And once we have that, then the next thing is going to be to specify whether we're going to use GraphQL as our interface. So I'll just come and say GraphQL is equal to true. Alright, now hoping that everything is fine, let's go ahead and run our server. So to run our server, I'm actually going to come to the terminal right here. I'll pull up our terminal and then I'll run. Since I'm using bash, I'm going to export our Flask app to our main.py, and then export our Flask debug to 1, so set our debug to true. It's actually going to be Flask debug, so this will be equal to 1, and then I'm going to come and run Flask. So we actually don't have any errors. So we don't have any errors. We are having some errors here, so cannot import that from GraphQL. Hope this doesn't actually affect what we are actually running. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and basically run our app with Flask run, and this is actually going to start our server, but we cannot import GraphQL argument map from GraphQL. So I'm actually going to search for this error. I don't know whether it's actually coming from. So I'll go right here, time to do a little bit of Stack Overflow. I'm going to search for it. My PC is a bit lagging. You excuse me for that. Let's actually go here. So cannot import name GraphQL. Let's see. Let's actually see what's happening here. So this is actually when they are using Ariane with Flask. So try to import Ariane query type, query async, that. So we're actually going to be using GraphQL core that's greater than 3.1. Let's try to do this. So let me copy this and paste it within our terminal. Let's actually first look at the GraphQL core that we have. I'm going to go right here and look into our requirements. So txt. So we have GraphQL core that is 2.3.2. Let me actually pull our terminal up and install our GraphQL core. That's our GraphQL core is actually less than 3.1. Wonder why this is actually not working. So hope we have some solutions. Seems the issue came from GraphQL core, which needs to be greater than or equal to 3. I was unable to install the version that, so I upgraded Python to 3.8. Let's actually look at some solutions that are specific to Graphene. I think I'll even have to specify that within my solution. I don't know how many people are watching at this point, but let me actually see right here. So 1, but you have 27 views. Okay, so thank you for sticking around. Let me actually come and say GraphQL augment map. Let's say I'm going to come and say that this is actually going to be from GraphQL argument type from GraphQL. So let me try searching for a solution that's specific to Graphene. Let's see if we have some. Let me see what's not actually working here. So when you go to our main.py, have a GraphQL view.asView schema, which is the schema we created here. So let me go back here and try to see in our steps if we have actually something that is as defined, that has something that we had here. So have GraphQL Flask GraphQL. So let me actually see their dependencies here. So install Graphene SqLAlchemy, Flask GraphQL. Let me actually try to install a version of Flask of GraphQL that's actually greater than what we have right now, and to see if we shall still have that error. So I'm going to pull up the terminal right here. Let's try installing GraphQL core that's actually greater than 3.1. Alright, so let me try running the server again with Flask run. So it seems like we still have an error here. I don't know where it's actually coming from. We're having from GraphQL import get default backend. We cannot import the get default backend from GraphQL. So if you're watching, maybe you can please provide a solution in the chat. I'd really appreciate. Alright, it seems like we even have a solution right here. So there's an issue here. So it seems like we are having they're telling us to install GraphQL core and this. So let me try to copy this and paste it in the terminal and see whether it will actually work. Just like any developer, my PC is a little bit lagging. So I'll basically paste this, and yeah, paste this. Actually paste this in here. Seems like my terminal is freezing or something. So it's actually going to go ahead and install them. Now let's be looking at other solutions. I think this is kind of the solution. Let's try to actually run this. Let's first wait for the installations to happen. Alright, so I'm going to pull up the terminal and try to run our server again. So it's in like we actually having this, so we are importing mapping and cannot import mapping from collections. I don't know what we have here, so let me try to actually see this. I don't know how many people are watching at this point. One viewer. Thank you for sticking around. So let me actually go back here. So cannot import name mapping from collections. So we're actually having cannot import mapping from collections. Let's try to see what they're saying here. Please show the full stack trace from collections import mapping from collections.abc import mapping. But where exactly is this? Because third party library, please try to update the library first. I think we shall have to reinstall our GraphQL and Graphene again. So let me try to actually do that. So I'll say pip install and then -u. Then I'm going to install Graphene. And then I think I'll do the same thing for Graphene SqLAlchemy and Flask GraphQL, so that we'll be able to see whether it will actually help. Alright, so let's try to actually do the same thing for Graphene SqLAlchemy. So I'm going to install the same thing, do the same thing for Graphene SqLAlchemy as well as Flask GraphQL. Let me actually look at how long this live stream has been. So we're actually in 1 hour and 16 minutes. Thank you for sticking around. Alright, so I'm going to try to let's say so this is Graphene SqLAlchemy. So we've done installing that, so let's try to actually go ahead and do the same thing for Flask GraphQL. So I'm going to say Flask and then GraphQL. Don't know if we're even installing the right package, but let me go right here to the documentation and I try to see. You guys will forgive me, my computer is somehow lagging. So alright, so I think we are on the right track, so I'll go ahead and try to save here and then go ahead and run our server with Flask run. Yeah, so now our server is actually running on localhost 5000. I'm going to go ahead and click this link so that you'll be able to see our browser. So when I go right here in our browser, this URL does not exist. So you're being told that it does not exist on our server. So let's go ahead and try to actually go to our /GraphQL. So right now we actually see our GraphQL, or what we call actually our GraphQL, which is a tool that allows us to graphically be able to create these requests, or our GraphQL requests, and then you'll be able to get responses or query actually. So let's try to query in this case. So I'm going to go here to our documentation. So we see they created a database, they created schemas, and now they actually populated the database. So let's carry out our first query. So since we have two fields, which are the user field as well as a post field on our main query class, or our root query class, we're going to go ahead and use them to query our data. So I'm going to go to GraphQL here, and then I'll come and say that we are actually going to have this as a query. Then I'll come, so we even actually have some auto completions here. So let's first query for our users. Now, since this is kind of a graph, we shall be able to access our fields using edges as well as nodes. So I'm going to come and specify edges, and then we shall have nodes. And in this case, when you have a node, then you can specify the different fields that you have on each node. So we're going to begin by our username field. So I'm going to press the play button. So it seems like we have some errors right here. So we are having an error of request object has no attribute get, and let's try to see or investigate where this error is coming from. So just like any other developer, I'm going to come and copy it. I'm going to close some of the tabs I have here. So feel free to give me some solutions in the chat. So I'm going to copy this and paste it, and then I actually want to go ahead and specify that this error is specific to Graphene. So I'm going to come here and say Graphene. Let's see where this is actually coming from. So we have some issues from GitHub here. Wonder how many people are still watching at this point. It's one viewer. Thank you for watching. So let's actually go ahead and fix this. So I'm going to go here, and then this video has actually got long to the extent where I think I'll add timestamps in the description so that you'll be able to actually follow along with whatever we've been doing and the different errors we faced. Alright, so I keep getting a request error. Request object has no attribute get, and they've defined their schema or their types on their GraphQL types. So you have a group type, material type, PDM type, classes type, group type. Okay, so let's see where the error comes from. So the error is similar to what we have. We are getting this error of request object has no attribute get, and let's try to see if someone has some solutions here. So actually having Sculpt session, which we actually declared on our session. Now we're supposed to actually add this specific field, or let me actually copy this so that we actually go ahead and define it on our base class. So I'm going to go back to our DB right here within our init.py. I'm going to close this for now. I'll come to where we declared our base class, so which is actually from base declarative base, and I think what I'm going to do is to basically put that right here. So we actually need to make use of our session. I think I'll bring our session and put it at the top here, and go to the top of our code. So I simply provide our session right here, and instead of having our DB session, we shall have our session. So we needed to attach the query property to our base class. And do we have our engine here? Let me actually see. Oh, this is actually supposed to come below the declaration of our engine, or the creation of the variable for our engine. now that you have this, I'm going to go ahead and save, hoping that everything is fine. Our server is going to actually restart since we are in debug mode, and I'm going to close this. So when I close that, I'm going to go back to our GraphQL right here, and then I'll try to send this request again, and wow, now we have our GraphQL endpoint working. So what we're saying is we are using our we're actually querying for all users as we defined on our types. So when you go back to our code right here, we actually defined our schemas or our types, and we defined on our main type or our root type that we actually have a field that returns all users, and we have a field that returns all posts. But it does not actually stop you from determining how you're going to return your posts. But since we're using the SQLAlchemy connection field, it actually makes it easier for us to return objects of SQLAlchemy types and return them as JSON, just like we see in our example. So let's do the same thing. So let's actually try to return on the emails. So I'm actually going to come here and return emails. So it's actually going to be returning our email. So when I press play, now we see that we're actually returning our user one email at email.com. So let's actually try to return both the username and the email. Now I'll just come and say that we're going to return our username and our email and press play. Now we see that we're getting both of the attributes, which is fine. Now let's try to do the same thing for our query for our posts. So I'm actually going to come right here. I'm going to kind of remove this, and what I'll do is to create all posts, and I'm going to come and specify that we shall have edges, and then on the edges we shall have a node that's going to allow us to access all the fields on our post. So let's say we want to get the title. So when I come right here, we actually have the title being returned, and we are returning the titles for the various posts that we have. When I come and also try to call our content, so let's try to return our content as well as our ID. Now I'm going to return our ID, and this is actually going to return for us our ID, and we now see that our data is being returned just like we have defined in our data requirements. So one of the beautiful things about GraphQL is it prevents you from overfetching data. Now just like you see here, when we call a field such as, let's say we only need the titles of these specific posts, what we shall have to do is to only query for the field of title, and then we shall be able to return data about titles only. So let me actually expand this, and shall be able to see only titles. And when you go ahead and also access only the IDs, let's say we are actually going to have IDs, so I'm actually going to be having the ID. So when I try to query for this, we're now going to see that we shall have our IDs being generated right here. So I hope you've learned from this video, and I'm actually going to be creating more videos on GraphQL where we shall look into things such as mutations and other concepts about GraphQL. I hope you've enjoyed this live stream. I'm actually going to start creating more live streams with time, and I hope you like this video. Please subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video. I think in the future I'll even have to create bigger live streams like this. It's kind of late from the country I come from, but I'm really thankful that you watched this video. Thank you for watching, guys, and see you in the next video. Bye.